Well, on something that's very important, if very alarming. I mean, the Good Friday Agreement indicated that there should be no divergence of rights on the island of Ireland, and I think that was reiterated by the UK government after Brexit. But you've actually indicated there's some significant divergence post or prior to Brexit, and that possibly more looms post-Brexit as well. And I suppose it's worrying that there was no equality law implemented in the Northern Assembly initiated by the Executive since the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, I know they were under the auspices of the EU, all of Britain and all of Ireland were, and that, okay, kept check on some rights. But I think what's most alarming is the figure of 42%, you say, who feel their rights are being reduced as a result of Brexit. Like, that's almost half the population. So I'm wondering, do you have any breakdown on that or any indication of what those rights are? And I suppose in the absence of a working assembly and, as we say, a long-awaited promised Bill of Rights, I mean, the onus is now on the UK government, but the direction that they're going in the bills that they've introduced is the opposite to what they should be going. And if you talk to people who are from a migrant or an ethnic minority background, most of them will tell you that they have encountered racism of some form during their lifestyle. But it seems that that's on the increase. It's on the increase everywhere. We can see it. And it's much more focal. It's much more in our face. And action has to be taken by both the Irish and the British government and the Northern Assembly when it gets up and going to actually counteract that. I'm just extremely worried about where it's all going and the impact that social media has. But so I'm just saying, like, do you have faith in the British government to do the right thing here in the absence of a Northern Assembly?
I'll not go as far as to make a comment on whether I have faith or not. I think that would be outside of my remit. But I share your concerns. You raised a number of issues. If I just mention the survey work that you referred to, that figure was from a survey result from last year. And we have just had the results of our most recent survey. And whilst I used a figure of 42% in 2022, you might be alarmed to know that the figures now for this current year have over half, 57%, were concerned or very concerned that their equality and human rights would be affected in the future, while 53% felt that their rights had already been reduced. Okay. Now, in terms of whether or not rights have been reduced, we're still plotting the divergence of rights and the scope for that, the potential for it. We were all very well aware that there was a gap because Northern Ireland has not had any legislative developments, albeit that with the exception of amendments that were imposed by Westminster at times when the Assembly was not functioning, and they came really on foot of EU directives or EU requirements. And the only exception to that has been the private members' bill in relation to some exceptions for teachers under the fair employment legislation. We have on many occasions been at the stage of consultation in relation to improvements in our legislation, but inevitably we get to a stage where there is disagreement between the political parties on some aspect of it, and we come to the next hiatus in the life of our Assembly, and it doesn't get progressed, or we've come to the end of a term and we're into election mode. And then it gets put back into the melting pot of the next programme for government, and nothing happens. If I take the example of age discrimination, back in 2016-2017, the parties, or the Assembly, had consulted on reformed or new legislation, which would address the potential discrimination for anyone of any age from birth right through. That issue of from birth to the age of 16 is what caused that consultation process to fail. And because the political parties couldn't agree on that, then the Assembly came to the end of its term and it's gone back into the bench. It still appears on the last programme for government, but again, there's been no action. Currently, we have a consultation exercise just closed, I think about 10 days ago, on reform to our race law. We welcome that very much because it takes on board most of the recommendations that the Equality Commission have been making for the past 15 years. And I don't exaggerate when I say 15 years. It is that long since we have been making recommendations for law reform. I think we are being advised by officials within the department that work is ongoing with political parties to consider the feedback from the various consultation exercises that have been underway to enable a quick win or quick progress should the Assembly get back into a functioning mode. We hope that's the case because that will give us some form of improvements to our race law. It has the potential also to deliver on very much needed reformed hate crime legislation, which will go some way to addressing racism. And there are many other strategies that again are at the consultation stage. In terms of racism and the fact that so many people from ethnic minority and migrant communities consider racism to be part of everyday life and don't raise an issue about it is really alarming. I have embarked on a series of outreach work right across Northern Ireland, from Strabane, Armagh, Lurgan, Ballymena, meeting with people from ethnic minority communities. And some of the stories that they have told me have been absolutely horrific in terms of the things that are said to them, the way in which they're treated, and more importantly, the confusion that exists in Northern Ireland amongst the public sector, the public services, as to the status of EU settled status and whether they've got pre-settled status or whether they have a share code, or what that actually means in terms of the continual having to provide evidence of their status and being charged for services that maybe they were entitled to or not denied access at all. I know of one particular case where a member of the Roma community, was denied treatment in a hospital, a terminally ill person, stage 4 cancer, sent home with paracetamol, and they wouldn't give her treatment. And that person had to be moved back to the country from which she came. And it was a case of her friends and the wider community raising funds to send her home for treatment. That shouldn't happen in a modern society. That is wrong. So there are many, many issues in terms of racism. Profiling, racial profiling at the border is another big issue. We have said before about how we get anecdotal evidence of such, and we know that the CAJ and the Northwest Migrants Forum apparently are developing some form of a database that would allow for real-time recording of incidents. We are on the record of having written to the Home Office. My colleague can talk about the work that she has done with the Garda in relation to racial profiling. But we have not made satisfactory progress. We have some examples of where we have supported people to take discrimination cases in relation to racial profiling at the airport and at ports, but not on the border. So we very much would welcome any further information, and I'm conscious I'm taking up so much time. I'm going to pass over to my colleagues.
Just in terms of whether we think it's going to be sorted, I think the answer to that is no. I'm not going to express it in terms of faith, but you can tell a little about what somebody's about to do from what they've already done. And evidence of intention, I think, can be taken from the current programme of work. And if you look at the illegal migration bill, I think it's one of the ones that tells you exactly what the intention is. And it includes things like, which were previously inconceivable, detention, arbitrary detention without judicial scrutiny, without even recourse to a judge for at least 28 days. And that can be pregnant women, children, etc. So those aren't oversights and they aren't mistakes, they're deliberate. And that tells me what I need to know about the intention to protect rights more generally. So we have to be very careful about what's coming and scrutinise every bill. And of course that's going to have an impact here as well, because somebody could inadvertently cross the border and fall foul of the Secretary of State's duty to be detained and removed.
But I mean, maybe just to kind of recap, I suppose, which I think is important, Deputy Tully, as you talk about the equality picture, if you like, on either side of the border, and obviously the commitment in the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, really was about bringing Ireland, this side of the border, up to the same level, if you like, whereas what we have now, as you have identified, is a picture whereby perhaps Northern Ireland is now the one that's lagging. I think I referenced in our last visit, but just to say it again, and again I'd be happy to circulate, that there is some really interesting academic literature in this space. Professor Chris McCrudden and Bryce Dixon have both written about it, and actually when you map it out, although they're not identical in the protections, there is a roughly similar size of protections, if you like, on both sides of the border, but they're weak in different areas, if you like. And I think it's important to acknowledge this is a moving picture here, and much more progress here than there would be in Northern Ireland. So, for example, the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth is currently reviewing equality law. We'll be inputting into that submission. But I think examples really bring this to life, and one of the examples from the report that we're discussing today is the European Accessibility Act, which is a directive that aims to improve the functioning of the internal market for accessible products and services. So these would be products used by older people and people with disabilities. And because it was the deadline for member states to implement the provisions of the Act was June 22, and it will become effective in 25. So that meant that the UK government wasn't required to transpose it, whereas we are. So that means that work is underfoot here, and that when that happens in 2025, there will be a different experience of standards of products. So it has a real deep impact on those people who use those products and their experience of it, both sides of the border. So that's a real example of where equality will be quite stark for people, and particularly those groups, disabled people and older people. And just to speak briefly, I know time is running out, but you did mention racism, I mean, just to say, I suppose, just to acknowledge that it is an issue in both jurisdictions. Of course, we have seen the National Action Plan Against Racism published now, following a 12-year gap, essentially, and we await that. But what I would like to call out is one of the biggest gaps that we have in this area, which is data. And that is a real need to capture the data, and that applies not only to the very specific area around equality or the ETA, but more generally, and that applies to racial profiling. As we see it, the potential for racial profiling on Garda Síochána, for example, cannot be measured right now because we don't yet have that data. So I don't want to take up any more time. I know you've got more questions.